gradual increasing level of sexual contact. And rubbing a leg is a good way of starting toward rubbing something else. But I don't know exactly, and it's so difficult for Robert to talk about it, and has been, even when he has talked about it, that I don't think we have complete details from him yet about the full extent of what took place.
But you don't have any doubt that he was sexually abused?
I don't.
And why is it so difficult, as you were discussing with boys, and in particular Robert, why was it so difficult for Robert to reveal instances of sexual abuse by his adoptive mother?
Well, sex is embarrassing. It's embarrassing for many people to talk about, not just special need, vulnerable kids like Robert. Being hurt by a mother who, again, is this cultural figure. It is the figure in life that you're supposed to be able to count on. And he couldn't count on her, so to talk about that is very difficult. You feel guilty. When you've engaged in a behavior, even if it wasn't your idea, even if you don't have the developmental capacity to understand fully what you're involved in, once you've done it, then you have a sense that you're partly responsible. You think you're going to get in trouble. So this placing responsibility, it's called attribution of responsibility. Where you place responsibility if you're a victim is quite often on yourself, even though in fact it was the adult's idea. So why victims don't talk more about it is very complex. It's shame, embarrassment, guilt, it's feeling responsible. It's the fact that they were in a relationship and they continued with it, so they were responsible for it.
And this is the final portion of this video.
Dr. Conte, before we were switching the tape, I wanted to ask you a particular question about Robert's adoptive father. Was his adoptive father active in protecting Robert from the sexual abuse of his adoptive mother?
Well, it depends a little bit what you mean by protective. There certainly is a report that Robert told his father, and his father told him to keep it secret. That isolates Robert from a protector. Now, his dad was a protective factor because of the close relationship, but in terms of actual physical protection from the sexual abuse, the father was not a protector.
What would that tell a child if the father is saying, keep this victimization of you a secret? What impact would that have on a kid?
Well, it tells you that there's something shameful about it, that you have to keep it a secret. It tells you that adults are not going to protect you from it, that even your dad is not going to protect you from it, and that it's somehow something you just have to endure.
Can you speak to the correlation of sexual abuse with the problems that Robert has reported to you?
Yes. I mean, I don't think that sexual abuse caused all of the problems he's presented with. He's got some very complex, possibly organic, possibly environmental set of emotional and behavioral and cognitive problems. But chronic stress, chronic trauma, such as being sexually abused, certainly can accentuate or intensify those symptoms. Symptoms like anxiety, depression, nightmares, certainly can be made worse by ongoing trauma. So the extent to which the sexual abuse over the course of his lifetime intensified or made worse these symptoms is not clear, but certainly that's typically what a trauma would do. It would be to take these symptoms and make worse. And some of these symptoms may be solely the result of having been sexually abused, like, for example, some anxiety and nightmares.
We've talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to ask you again, why is it difficult for sexually abused kids to be forthcoming about the abuse they suffered at the hands of their abuser?
Well, first of all, it's the norm. Only 30% of sexual abuse takes place one time. So most abuse goes on. It often goes on for decades. Delay in disclosure is the norm. It's especially hard for boys to talk about sex. It's shameful. You're afraid you're going to get in trouble. You might partly feel responsible. when you're abused by a mother who is supposed to be a caregiver and nurturer and supposed to be the one person in the world you can count above all others, it's even harder to talk about. When your entire life you've been isolated, when you don't have friends and you don't have other adults, teachers, or what have you that have kind of reached out to you, when you've been ridiculed and sort of don't have the same sense of self-esteem that you can tell and people are going to listen to you. Essentially, you don't tell because there's nobody you think will sort of listen.
What is it about Robert that makes it even more difficult for him to reveal the traumatic events that occurred to him in his life, including the sexual abuse by his mother?
Well, I think I've sort of said many of them, but again, this is an extremely vulnerable kid. This is a kid whose the first 2 years of his life did not prepare him to have a sense of self and be able to negotiate the world. He gets into a family where he's isolated. He has physical appearance and vision problems and behaviors that further isolate him from other people. No caring adult seems to take him under his wing, although there certainly were teachers that for a year really tried, but there's no consistent adult who will help him feel protected. And so he's essentially isolated and controlled and dependent on the very person that's using him for her own sexual purposes.
You've rendered an opinion that Robert was sexually abused by his mother. What type of information did you rely on to reach that determination?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not a lie detector. I have talked to many, many victims. Some people I've talked to who claim to be victims are not terribly believable, and so I've tended to discount what they've told me. I think one of the most significant factors is that he started talking about this in the late 1970s before the crime that we're here dealing with even took place. And although he also took it back at times too, that's fairly consistent. A lot of male victims do that. He's not very bright. What he describes is completely possible. He describes a grooming process that would be consistent with grooming. So again, I'm not a lie detector, but I think the most important thing is the early disclosure before he was in trouble.
Is your opinion also based on the frequency of his reporting and the fact that it occurred over many, many years, as you pointed out, beginning in the 70s?
Yes, especially before there was a clear secondary gain for claiming it. And there are other things. I mean, little sort of things you wouldn't expect. There's an indication in the report, I believe Robert also told me, that his mother liked rough sex because she'd learned it from her father. It's not just the kind of thing that somebody makes up. So these little details that sort of come out and you think, well, if you didn't have the experience, you wouldn't know to make that up.
Were there other observers in Robert's life that suspected something very wrong was going on at home? For example, school teachers,
Yes.
healthcare workers?
Not a lot, but yes, there are certainly indications in the record. And it's not always clear what, but another thing I'd point out is that, one of the physicians early on with Robert described mother as secretive and controlling information. There's no one characteristic of a sex offender, and certainly female sex offenders are very rare, but control, keeping information, keeping secret, controlling would be one of the elements that a sex offender would use to keep other people from learning or suspecting, or keep the child isolated so there's no one else they can tell about what's going on. And then if you're a child who you've told your father, and your father told you to keep the secret, you're in one sense a perfect victim. You're isolated, and when you did try to tell, it was unsuccessful.
Can you speak to some of the particular features of the mother-son sexual abuse relationship, if you will, that further impacted Robert?
Well, you mentioned relationship. It is a relationship, and that's what's so confusing about it. This is a person who you're dependent on. There may have been many positive things about the relationship between Robert and his mother. besides the sexual abuse. And so, again, because of the psychological role that mothers have and the cultural role, when you're hurt by a mother, the betrayal is greater. It can have a greater psychological impact. You can be further isolated.
In your review of Robert's social history, it's my understanding that you looked at the history, some of the history of Robert's adoptive mother and her side of the family. Was there a history of sexual abuse on the adoptive mother's side of the family?
You know, I don't recall specifically.
How do the deficits that Robert suffered from, intellectual, emotional, psychological, interact with and compound one another?
Well, in many complex, I'll give you an example. Affect regulation, the ability to control emotions, is something that we begin to learn when we're 2. We had that when we're young, not at 2, but in that early infant stage. If you had the kind of world I described and the world you take in is chaotic, then you don't develop the same ability to control emotions and affect. If you have this kind of complex problem, again, he had virtually every diagnosis, you know, that he's almost a history of diagnosis in my field. You have some kind of complex diagnosis. You're immature. You have poor reasoning. You have low intellect, which links to the poor reasoning. Then you don't have the same problem-solving abilities. You don't have the same sense of self-efficacy. Sense of self-efficacy is our sense of ourself and whether we can make things happen. So you're probably easier to control. You're an easier victim. Not everybody gets abused. Vulnerable people tend to get abused, and he was in that sense a kind of perfect victim.
Based on your many years of training and experience working with victims of sexual abuse, is it extraordinary to find the constellation of deficits and symptoms displayed by Robert?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. I think both the first 2 years of his life and then this exceeding complex physical, psychological, behavioral, cognitive, emotional set of deficits. The isolation that he experienced throughout his development, I think it's very, very unique. I can't compare human suffering, but just in terms of objective facts, if you look at the course of this man's life as a child, an adolescent, and then a young adult, there are overwhelming vulnerabilities, more than I can remember seeing in a single case.
Why would a person kill an abuser after he or she has escaped being under, for lack of a better word, will of the abuser? For example, if you're now an adult, you're living outside of the home where you were with the abuser.
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, one of the things you have to remember about trauma memory is that when you are re-experiencing, maybe because you're in the presence of the person who has hurt you, or if you are being hurt again, you're having sex again with your mother, then the distance between all of the events in time and space disappear, and you are re-experiencing as if it is happening. So you are experiencing all these instances that have happened before. If you are immature, you have low IQ, you have poor affect regulation, then you don't have the same ability to control the overwhelming trauma memories, and don't have the same capacity to step back and think, no, wait a minute, I'm going to be safe in a few hours because I'll be back in prison, or I'll be back away from the person. And so somebody with the characteristics that this man had, and the fact that he is overwhelmed by trauma memories, means and that he can't solve this overwhelming flood of emotion in the same way that somebody with higher IQ or more adaptive skills might, the better ability to regulate affect.
Why would an abuser be the trigger for the type of violence that occurred in this case, in Robert's case?
Well, again, I think with somebody who has this complex set of problems, this IQ immaturity, affect regulation problems, I think that's part of the explanation. Again, when you have a trauma memory, because of the nature of trauma, there's no separation. It's like you're re-experiencing it again. Killing is a very primitive act, and when you kill a parent, because of, especially a mother, because of who mothers are, again, culturally and psychologically, you're doing something extremely primitive. And because your mind, especially in the mind of an immature, low IQ individual such as we've described, you're killing somebody that's literally larger than life. You're not killing a person who's old and you see their handicaps and they're frail. You're killing this internal representation of this all-powerful parent who isolated you. And in fact, in some ways, the flood of all the trauma, you're not just killing your mother, you're killing all the other people that hurt you and abandoned you and teased you. And so you kill this person who is like a giant psychologically. And so in many kids who kill parents, there's a sort of phenomena of overkill. They shoot more than is necessary. They'll kill and then they'll put things over the dead parent, trying to keep that dead parent from coming to life again. So again, at its most basic, killing anybody is a primitive act. But when you have the kind of mental and emotional capacities that this man has, and you're killing a parent who is this larger-than-life figure, who you had this insecure, dependent, hostile attachment with throughout your whole life, you overdo it. You do far more than is necessary to stop the abuse, or far more than is necessary to stop the memory. As much as anything, although you're behaving in the real world, the crime you're committing is in your head, and it's against a giant of a person.
Why would a victim of childhood sexual abuse, particularly when the abuser is a parent, make statements that are inconsistent with earlier statements of reporting, of indicating that they've been abused?
Well, it depends on the level of inconsistency. For a victim to say at one time they were abused and another time to deny it could be a reflection of their own ambivalence. It could be that they now don't feel safe. It could be they're trying not to think about it and pushing it away. So if the inconsistency is at a level of did it happen or not happen, those are some of the reasons. Now, if you describe a particular incident and then you describe it a completely different way another time, which I don't think is true in this case, then there are other explanations for that.
When your own death is imminent, whether it be by natural causes or the state is seeking the execution of you, why at that point in time would a victim of sexual abuse continue to make an inconsistent statement about their abuser?
Same reasons. You know, if you're about to go out of this life, at times you don't want to go out as a victim. You don't want people to know what happened. You don't want to know what your mother did to you because, again, of the role mothers have in life. So it's the same sort of thing. Some people will take with them forever the lie that it didn't happen, or some will be ambivalent about it.
Does it, or can it speak to the depth of the shame and humiliation and guilt that a victim has suffered throughout their life?
Typical.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the constellation of factors in Robert's life, the isolation, the abandonment, the neglect, the sexual abuse, impacted and shaped the person he is today?
Well, it's certainly, I have no doubt that it affected the person that committed the crime. The person he is today has been in a secure environment. He's been protected. He's had meals. So the man that we see today, and again, I haven't seen him for some number of years, but typically is not the man who committed the crime. So there's absolutely no question that his development impacted and made him who he was at the time he committed the crime. My guess is that the security of a prison and the safety, as weird as this sounds, he's a different person today.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'd like to next introduce Catherine Lloyd. She's a non-practicing barrister from London, England, and she's going to speak a little bit more about Mr. Moorman and his loved ones.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, as Ms. Hall has indicated, my name is Catherine Lloyd. I'm from England, and when I heard the extreme mitigating factors in Mr. Moorman's case, I felt that I should travel here to aid Ms. Hall and Miss Young in his defence. I've been here since early January, and since that time I've got to know Robert. As part of getting to know him, and in preparation for this hearing, I have spoken on the phone and asked them to write letters of all of Robert's pen pals. Robert has no living relatives. His last, Paul Schweitzer and Marilyn Nichols, having died a number of years ago. And so to Robert, his pen pals and his attorneys are his family. When speaking to these people, it was touching to me that despite his intellectual problems, he has managed to form close bonds with these people. I'm now going to explain the relationships he has formed and read some excerpts from the letters that the pen pals sent me. We do have copies of all of these letters if any of the board members would like to read them at the end. The first person I'm going to speak about is Denise Burgess. She's a 4th grade teacher from Castro Valley and has been a teacher for over 30 years. She first started writing to Robert 11 years ago in September 2000 at the suggestion of her priest, Father Nacho Gameros. He suggested Robert, having heard that all of Robert's living relatives had died. They've exchanged letters every month or two for the past 11 years, and Denise describes their relationship as a close one. She writes, "From the time I started writing to Robert, I realised he had some mental deficiencies. Father Nacho had told me Robert was mentally like a 9-year-old, and I could see by his letters that this was true. First of all, he has a childlike belief system. He seems to have an unwavering belief that Jesus is in charge of his life. Although his faith has been of great source of consolation to him, his beliefs are like those of a child, simple and unquestioning. Also, his letters are written more like a child than an adult. The letters are fairly legible, but are full of errors in spelling, capitalization, and punctuation. Many 4th graders can write with fewer errors than Robert does. I've learnt a lot about Robert's character, not only through his letters, but also through essays he has sent, some written by himself and some copied from others. From these, I came to realise how much he regretted the crimes he committed. His essays refer to sorrow for his past wrongdoings. Robert's letters show him to be a well-mannered and positive person. He always refers back to the previous letter I wrote him, makes comments on the things that I share with him, and offers consoling words if I tell him I have bad news. It was very distressing to hear the news that Robert has been given an execution date. Considering his background, it is obvious he should not be executed. It is clear that the murder he committed would never have happened if he had not been abused and mistreated as a child. He is remorseful for his crime and has been a model prisoner for years. I am earnestly appealing to you to recommend clemency for Robert." The second person I spoke to was Sister Marianne Schwer. She is a nun in Green Valley, Arizona. She's been writing to Robert for 3 years, and they've exchanged letters on quite a regular basis. In our telephone conversation, Sister Marianne spoke of how aware she is of Robert's intellectual deficits. She stated Robert is not intelligent and quite simple. In her letter, she expands on this to say that due to his learning problems, his messages are always very brief. Robert has spoken to Sister Marianne regarding the death of his mother, and she explains to the board in her letter that she is convinced he is truly repentant. Sister Marianne is very impressed with Robert's religious outlook also. Sister Marianne writes to this board to ardently request that you recommend clemency for Robert. I then spoke to Thomas Howard. He is a religious academic, and Robert was the one who first contacted him 10 years ago after seeing some of his writings in the religious materials that Robert has devoted himself to. Since that time, they have exchanged letters monthly. Thomas stated to me on the phone that he thinks of Robert warmly and prays for him regularly. Thomas also explained to me on the phone that over the years he has come to see that Robert's thinking is very basic, and when I asked him what mental age he would place Robert at, he said elementary school level. Thomas writes in his letter, "I gather from Robert's handwriting and syntax and the sentiments found in his letters that he must have only had a minimal education." Thomas further talked in his letter of Robert's sensitive and peaceful nature. He writes, "The impression of Robert I have formed as I've read his letters month by month and year by year is of a very humble and simple man. He seems to wish ill to no one at all. Never once has there been any note either of chafing at his imprisonment or of resentment towards the legal system. Thomas expressed to me that he is deeply upset to think that the state may execute Robert, and he does wish to ask this board to recommend clemency." I also spoke to Louise Irby. Louise is a resident of Texas, and Robert and her have been writing for 6 years. She started writing to Robert after her daughter became involved with a prisons project, and her daughter suggested that Louise may want to write to an inmate. Louise writes, "It seems to me that Robert is not very intelligent. When our correspondence first started, he would send short, simple sermons to me to type up and send back to him. There were many spelling and grammatical errors that I would correct as I typed them. For the past couple of years, he has not sent the sermons with his letters, as he has been very ill and as his eyesight has worsened. His letters have always been fairly short, about half a page on notebook paper. A letter from 5 years ago would be indistinguishable from one I would receive today. In his letters, Robert would comment in answer to problems I have mentioned and would tell me that he would pray for me and my family." Now, Louise is slightly different to the other pen pals in that she has herself 3 children with schizophrenia. Her youngest daughter is the worst affected, and Louise shared with me on the phone that 2 years ago, her youngest daughter, while suffering an episode, stabbed her son, a 7-year-old autistic boy, a number of times. Louise's daughter was found not guilty by reason of insanity and now resides in a mental institution. Louise stated that she has often written to Robert about this and about the stress it's caused her. She wrote that in response to these letters, Robert seemed very concerned and asked if he could write letters to Louise's daughter and give her some advice. He wrote to Louise's daughter a couple of times, very short letters, but in those letters he told her that he was praying for her, and he told her that she should always take her medicine. In addition, Robert has expressed his remorse for his crime to Louise. He told her, "I did a very bad thing," and he said that he was very sorry he had done it. Louise writes that there is a real possibility that her daughter could have killed her grandson that night, and if she did, her daughter could be sitting on death row now. She writes from her experience in regard to Robert's family that killing Robert will not bring back his adoptive mother, but will only add to the sorrows the family has had to live through. She concludes that she hopes the board will see its way to recommending clemency for Robert. William Ferretti is the next person that I spoke to. He is a resident of California and has been corresponding with Robert for just under 10 years. He writes, Robert never fails to show concern for my well-being, nor for that of the friends and family who I have mentioned in my letters. He is more gracious and considerate than a good many people I encounter in daily life. Writing to Robert has led me to appreciate how fortunate I have been, especially in that I was raised by gentle, kind, and loving parents. Something none of us should take for granted. By all accounts, Robert's adoptive mother routinely abused him. I cannot imagine how horrible it would be to endure that. Any childhood abuse can lead to serious dysfunction later in life, but sexual abuse by that one person most responsible for your care and upbringing is the greatest of all betrayals and produces the greatest disorders in those exposed to it. My overall impression is that Robert grew up mentally and emotionally challenged. The crime he committed was obviously not the action of a person holding normal intelligence and emotional balance. It would be insane on our part to hold him as fully accountable for his actions as those of us who have been considerably better blessed. Robert does not shirk responsibility for his actions. It is obvious that he sincerely regrets his crimes, and he would undo them if he could, but of course none of us has that ability. Robert has said repeatedly that his faith and trust are in the Lord, and that he will accept whatever is in store for him. I truly envy his childlike faith. Nothing will be gained by killing Robert, and a great deal will be lost. Please do not kill Robert. Do the right thing and allow him to live out whatever time his poor health may leave to him in prison. Please recommend him clemency. The final person I spoke to has been a nurse for more than 35 years. Her name is Suzanne Roth, and she lives in North Carolina. Her and Robert have developed a very close bond whilst corresponding for 9 years. They've exchanged hundreds of letters and spoke on the telephone at least once a month throughout that period. She writes, "When I first began my correspondence with Robert, I found him to be extremely simplistic and immature. His letters were written by a man who impressed me as being mentally retarded with an emotional and intellectual maturity of no more than 10. His capacity for self-expression is extremely limited and immature in character. If anything, his writing and self-expression has deteriorated since. Robert would occasionally send me what he described as drawings, poems, or stories for me to type up. These appeared to be crafted by an individual with extremely limited intellectual and emotional development. Misspellings and grammatical errors were the norm, and a lack of insight and maturity were evident. I expressed to Robert's attorney that his intellectual capacities show him quite clearly to be mentally and emotionally in a very low range, certainly below an IQ of 70. When informed by her that some past tests have failed to recognise that he is mentally retarded, I was, and remain, stunned. This runs completely counter to the impression I have invariably had of Robert during regular exchanges for nearly a decade. At best, contacts I have had with Robert leave me with the firm conviction that his intellectual and emotional maturity are at the level of a person of elementary school age. Robert has adjusted well to incarcerated life. He has rarely received any sort of disciplinary action, and as I understand it, none of these are considered to be violent infractions. Furthermore, he has frequently indicated to me that he is remorseful for his actions that led to his incarceration. Thus, I plead with you to recommend commutation of Robert's sentence to one of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." When I spoke to Suzanne, she asked if she could send me a poem that Robert had sent her in the past. She attached the poem to her letter. I've read it. This is a letter that Robert wrote to his adoptive father. He always called his adoptive parents his step-parents, and so that's who he is referring to in this poem. "Back and forth and round I go, but one day I'll leave this earth and no one will ever miss me. But I can't wait until I can be with my stepfather in heaven. He is my friend. I love him and miss him very much. Please forgive me for the things I did that hurt you and for my sins with my stepmom. I love you and want to be with you in heaven and be with our Father, God." those were the conversations I had with the pen pals. There are two more who are very close and share a special bond with Robert. They are here today, and Miss Hall is now going to ask them some questions.
Thank you. And I think the time now is 10 o'clock. I think we're going to take a break. About 10, 15 minutes. Everybody can get up, and we'll resume maybe 10, 15 minutes. Thank you. As well, if he needs to